On January 30th, 2023, Jared tweeted, "A lot of people on here have what I'd call a noble savage view of normies." This is the Museum of Twitter, the show where we talk about the most important tweets in the history of Twitter.com. This tweet is a bit heady, but I promise you it is 100% true. Just to get out of the way, let's define what a noble savage is. Noble savage is a sociological term, and it refers to the way that people in advanced civilizations can, in a condescending fashion, ascribe a nobility to people in what they consider more primitive civilizations. The ways, for example, that 17th century explorers would view the indigenous peoples of the United States and saying oh, they're one with nature. They don't worry about gold and cities, and they don't have conflict with each other, yada yada yada. Of course, this isn't true. People are all people. While you can argue there are benefits of living in a more primitive society, living in a more primitive society does not make one more noble or less violent or more in touch with the world or whatever. And specifically, the term noble savage refers to how condescending that is. The inherent tension there is that the people who are saying these things about primitive civilizations aren't living in those primitive civilizations. In fact, they're usually working to eliminate those primitive civilizations. And in a lot of ways, it's just a way for people from the more advanced civilization to sublimate their guilt about destroying another civilization. Oh, they really lived a simpler life, didn't they? Which is a thing you could observe, I guess, but you just bulldoze an entire civilization, so what good does that do them? But anyway, going back to the tweet, what Jared is saying is that a lot of people online take this view towards normies. Normies being a term that is not strictly definable, but basically it's people who are not online all the time. Specifically people who live quote-unquote normal lives, who have mainstream tastes. It's not always used in opposition to being extremely online, but when it's used on Twitter, it usually is used that way. And so the point that Jared is making is that a lot of people who are extremely online will act like there's some nobility in the ignorance or in the primitiveness of people who are not online. I have a lot of examples of Jared's tweet being used, but I think that this is the best demonstration of someone taking a noble savage view towards normies. Quoting a video of a girl at her high school graduation, Carhartt Poppy tweeted, "If you've ever been around middle-class suburban white people, you'd know it's easy for them to get married not just because of the lack of emotional trauma and financial stress, but also because they don't marry based on ideologies or shared interest. They barely have a sense of self." So what she's basically saying is oh, things are so easy for middle-class white people because they don't care about ideology, because they don't care about trauma, because they don't have any sense of self. Things are so easy, they can just marry whoever they want. And so that's why Serge Janie McBride used the Jared tweet in response. Because Jesus Christ Almighty is Carhartt Poppy being condescending. I'm sure that middle-class white people would love to hear that they have no sense of self. And so you can see, in a way, the parallels between what Carhartt Poppy is saying about suburban middle-class white people and what people were saying about noble savages. In the same way that 17th century Europeans were denying indigenous peoples their own sense of self by acting like they were in touch with things simply because they didn't live in a civilization. Carhartt Poppy is acting like middle-class white people in the suburbs have an easier life simply because they don't have the same level of interiority that she does. And in the same way, if a European actually talked to an indigenous person about their life, they would find that, oh, everyone has human problems, no one's life is inherently easier because of where they live or how they live. If Carhartt Poppy actually spoke to suburban white people, she would obviously learn that they have a sense of self. They're people, everyone has a sense of self. Sorry, this tweet in particular really pisses me off. And I think this idea was put really beautifully in a reply to the original tweet from Jared, where Rivers said, "The dichotomy between normie and terminally online is a false one. So-called normies are just as obsessed with inane bullshit that you will never witness, let alone comprehend. The tiny dramas and joys of humanity are infinite in the variety, and none of us can see them all." There's an idea that a lot of terminally online people have, that people who are not expressing all of their anxieties and their concerns on Twitter or on Instagram all the time somehow are not experiencing anxieties and concerns. It's no, life is difficult for everyone. Another example of this is Bobby Mars tweeted, "Done with the weird bitches. Gonna meet a normie girl on Hinge. 27 or so with a boring professional email job. Likes to go to brunch. Has a doggo. Dyed blonde hair. Goes to the gym and does meme workouts to make her ass bigger. Has never felt real pain in her life." Now, Thumbs correctly quoted this and put the Jared screenshot. Because what Bobby's implying is that this type of person is simpler. That their ignorance towards all the weird stuff that Bobby's previous dates were worried about makes them an easier person to date. And so even if they're less sophisticated, they're less stressful. And once again, that's so deeply condescending. And I don't think it's an accident that the two examples I first pulled up both involve someone implying that this type of person has never felt pain. It's almost like people like Bobby and Carhartt Poppy are implying that if your pain and trauma doesn't express itself in a sort of neuroticism that you put on the internet, therefore that means you didn't experience pain. When it's no, people with real pain and trauma are living normal-ass lives all over. And it comes up a ton in ways that are less obviously condescending. Robin did a post about how if society was filled with just normie people, the trains would be running on time, we'd have sound architecture, walkable cities, and Fraser quoted it with Jared's tweet because that's ridiculous. Yeah, do super online anxious people cause problems for the world? Sure, but a lot of problems are caused by quote-unquote normies. And I think that this gets back to another problem with the whole idea of noble savage in both the actual context and this context, which is how do you define what a normie is? In the same way you can't really define someone who's in an advanced civilization or whatever. Espresso Loading puts it best. best. Normie is the first postmodern social construct. It literally means something completely different that is wholly contingent on the POV of an individual and the personal value system they operate on to maintain their identity as adjacent to normie / not cringe, which I think is absolutely spot on. You really can only define what a normie is in opposition to what you consider not a normie. Like, no one would ever self-identify as a normie. And when people use the word normie, what they just mean is someone who is less online or less this, that, or the other than I am. And that's not a very helpful category. But it's how people can basically get online and say people who are more normie than me are happier because they're more ignorant. In the same way that a 17th century explorer can say people who are more primitive than me are more happy because they're ignorant. A way this comes up a lot is in terms of gender and dating, like with Bobby. Ellie Schnick quote tweeted a photo of a regular looking guy and said, "This is the type of man who will save you, by the way, not the one with the letterboxed." Which, like, yeah, guys with letterboxed can be annoying, but regular guys can be annoying too. And possibly the one that I felt in my soul the most is when D tweeted, "The average frat guy is infinitely less misogynistic than the average male leftist. Let's start there." Previous guest on the show, Cohen, quoted that and put a screenshot of Jared's tweet. Because it's like, D, you only think that because you know a lot of male leftists and you don't know a lot of frat guys. Like, people who are not super politically active, who are not super active online, can still be really bad people, you know? Like, you really do have to take a noble savage view of normies to ever think that this could possibly be true. There is no virtue in not being a super online weirdo. Now, a very funny example of this phenomenon is that the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer literally does have this view. Like, he has said on multiple occasions that he imagines a specific couple of voters that he is trying to appeal to, called the Baileys, and he says things like, they're not ideologues, they're worried about property taxes, it's a tax they hate, and that's what Democrats don't get. So in case you're wondering why he makes bad decisions, it's because he has a noble savage view of normies. And this construction, a lot of people have what I'd call a noble savage view of XYZ, is used for other groups. When there's the Tumblr post from Hades of the ladies that said, "Humanity sucks, you mean men. Humans are so cruel, you mean men," etc., etc. DL Trade Union has said, "A lot of people on here have what I'd call a noble savage view of women." Frankie Faye observes that you people have a noble savage view of autistic men, and it's very odd. Lesbian Vizier notes, "I think you guys have what I would call a noble savage view of Hayao Miyazaki." Nine says that a lot of people on here have what I call a noble savage view of NIMBYs. And two that I have to say I do fall prey to is Cam pointing out that some of you have what can only be described as a noble savage view of Tom Cruise. Guilty. And Edgar Mentum says some of you have a noble savage view of resist liberals. Also, I'm very guilty of that. Look, I get where this comes from. I think in like the late aughts to mid 2010s, there definitely was a type of person who looked down on people who weren't very online. They were like, I'm in the know, I'm on the cutting edge of stuff, this person's a sheep, they just care what's on TV. And I think that that was really unhealthy. But I think in some ways there was a backlash to that and like an overcorrection where people who were very online started to get very depressed about that fact and were like, well no, people who are not online at all, they have the right idea. And in some ways that probably is true for their mental health. But I think the self-hatred has tipped the scales to where people are like, no, people who are not online, they live simple lives, they live on farms, they frolic all the time. Oh, how simple would my life be if I was just ignorant to the world's problems and I could just live a normal life? And the truth is, one, no one is stopping you from living a normal life. If you're anxious about how online you are and you think life is so much better if you're not online, you can just get offline. And two, no one would ever describe their lives as problem-free. We all got problems. And thinking that there's a group of people who doesn't have problems, say normies, will make you look really stupid. For better or worse, if you're terminally online or a normie, we're all in the same boat. And that boat is called the human experience. If you want to support the show, please join my Patreon, patreon.com/museum of Twitter, where you can vote when I cover on Subscriber Sundays, and you get a weekly bonus episode called the Museum of Not Twitter.